I'm here with State Representative Lance Kinzer of Olathe discussing the recently completed 2011 Kansas legislature.
Today we're going to talk about the conclusion of the 2011 legislative session, particularly focusing on some of the larger issues we dealt with, the budget, our focus on economic growth, some of the accomplishments we had this year with respect to the pro-life issue. Then we'll conclude perhaps by talking about some of the issues that maybe don't get as much attention, but that I was particularly involved in during the session and will continue to be working on as we move into 2012.
The major issue of this session was passing a balanced budget for 2012. Explain what was done.
Our budget struggles in Kansas are not simply a blip created by a down economy, but that in fact we have very significant structural problems with our budget. There are three basic cost drivers within the Kansas budget. One of those is the ongoing issue of how we best and most efficiently finance K-12 education. We have a huge challenge with respect to a massively underfunded public employees pension system, somewhere around $8 billion in the red. And in addition to that, ever escalating Medicaid costs, which certainly create an issue that's difficult for us to deal with at the state level because so much of that is mandated from the federal government. At the end of the day, it was unfortunate in my view that we still passed a budget that grew the state general fund by approximately 6%, and in addition to that spent about $200 million more than available tax revenue based upon the estimates at the time. My view was that we could have and should have done better, and the reality is that there's no easy way to deal with the budgetary crisis in Kansas. The simple fact is that two budget items, education and social services, amount to almost 90% of the state general fund budget.
What budget challenges lie ahead for the session next year?
I think we're going to be facing a struggle very similar to the one that we faced this past year. And some of what allowed us to be able to spend over our existing tax revenue, the ability to borrow from other funds, we've been told pretty explicitly that opportunity won't be there, that we've essentially gone to the well as many times as we can. And so I think what you're going to see is perhaps another situation where the feds are demanding that we spend more, that there's less federal money available, and that our ability to play games with the budget by borrowing from other sources has really reached an end.
Creating more jobs for Kansas was a major theme of Governor Brownback. What was done to move that agenda forward?
I think the governor was really focused, particularly in this first legislative session, on trying to deal with a host of structural issues with respect to the way that Kansas goes about trying to promote economic growth. There was a significant amount of reorganization at a structural level, looking at economic development programs that Kansas has had in place for a significant period of time, asking whether those in fact are actually accomplishing the things that they're set out to do, and then doing some consolidation. And so there were some economic development programs that were frankly done away with, so that more resources could be put into those programs that have shown the most bang for the buck. There was a kind of one core economic development bill this year. It allowed for indexing or allowing businesses to more quickly write down expenses when they make new purchases. There was within that bill exactly what I was just talking about, getting rid of some economic development programs that weren't working so well, focusing more on programs where we are seeing more success.
Summarize what was accomplished on pro-life issues this session.
Well, this was a tremendous session with respect to protecting the sanctity of life, and anyone who's followed Kansas politics for many years knows that over the years of the Sebelius and Parkinson administration, while the legislature became increasingly inclined to extend additional protections to the unborn, we met very significant opposition from an administration that, quite frankly, was very committed to and in large part financed by the abortion industry in Kansas. At a practical level, what we have done is made sure, I think with almost absolute certainty, that no one could come to Kansas and use the same loopholes and evasions that allowed Dr. Tiller to set up one of the largest and most aggressive late-term abortion practices in the country right here in Kansas. We've also tried to make sure that Kansas has a better law with respect to the issue of parental involvement. In fact, Kansas went from being one of a minority of states that only required some sort of parental notice to now having the most rigorous, I would say, parental consent law in the country. We've also taken significant steps to try to protect women once they make a decision to have an abortion by having a clinic licensure regime that ensures that basic health and safety and sanitation standards are met in abortion clinics.
What legislation were you most involved with and gave you the most satisfaction?
One of the pieces of legislation that was really gratifying to me, although we didn't make it all the way through the process, was the issue of judicial selection, which is something I've been involved in for a number of years. Kansas is the only state in the country that has a system for judicial selection at the appellate court level, where the nominees are selected by a panel of that's a majority of which are attorneys selected by other attorneys. That creates, in my view, a very insular and elitist system that, frankly, is not good ultimately for the people of Kansas. A system that is much more open and transparent and that has a degree of responsibility for people who are accountable through elections, I think, is absolutely crucial. And so while I'm not calling for direct election of judges, I do think having a Senate confirmation process and allowing the governor to choose the people that he believes are the very best nominees, as opposed to having that process controlled by a very small number of attorneys, would be much better for the state of Kansas.